Thank you so much for having me today. It's been 21 years since the arrival of Hana's Suitcase. George, Laura, and I have traveled to many places in the United States. We were in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Mobile, Alabama, St. Louis, Seattle, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and we were so close to you in Naples when we spent a week in Fort Myers. We were very close. It's a pleasure and honor for me to be able to share with you this story behind Hana's Suitcase. This one simple suitcase has changed my life, and it has given over 200,000 students at 1,200 schools in Japan a chance to learn about the history and its lessons of the Holocaust. To begin a little bit about how Tokyo Holocaust Education Center, which we now call ourselves Kokolo, was founded. In the late 90s, there was this nerve gas attack by a cult group in the middle of Tokyo. Well-educated young people were among the members of the group. And at the same time, we also had a grave concern with this increasing violence among young students and a series of child murder by a teenager in 1987 shook the country. And this small group of friends, teacher and mother, college professors got together, and we wanted to start a kind of informal education to teach about tolerance, compassion, respect. And Japan may look very homogeneous society, but in fact, we have a history of discrimination and prejudice against minority groups. In recent years, we have seen rise in hate speech rally against Korean minority groups. So we have, our society have lots of challenges, and we hoped that by showing students what intolerance and hatred had done to other people in the past, they would learn to embrace differences at younger age. And we came up with an idea of using example of the Holocaust, especially stories of 1.5 million Jewish children. And my first project was to organize an exhibition on the experience of children during the Holocaust. And I wanted something tangible. I wrote to museums all over Europe and to ask if I could borrow any objects for display. And museum at Auschwitz agreed to lend us a few objects. And looking back now, the biggest miracle for me is that the Auschwitz Museum picked up this one particular suitcase out of nearly 4,000 suitcases left at Auschwitz. You may know, yes, it was them who made the decision to pick up this one particular suitcase, which had the name Hana Brady, and lent it to us. When it arrived in 2000, spring 2000, we knew nothing about the owner of the suitcase. Here, let me go back. And I honestly didn't know how to use this one simple suitcase to tell the story of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jewish people were killed. And then it was this group of Japanese students who helped me find the way with one simple question: who was Hana Brady? And these students were curious to know about the fate of one little girl. The number of Jewish victims, 6 million, is hard to grasp, but to see the owner of the suitcase, such real object in front of them, was one of them, and that she was their age, they were curious to know more about Hana. And they made me realize that I wanted to give the Holocaust a human face. I wanted to make this, I thought that if I could answer questions from these students, I thought that maybe I can turn this suitcase into something special. I wanted to make this suitcase a symbol of life and not of death of an unknown child. So my search for Hana Brady started, but I am not a historian and I had never done any research like that before. I didn't know where to start, where to go, but through some communication with the Auschwitz Museum, we learned that Hana was at another concentration camp called Terezin before she was sent to Auschwitz. And many of you, I'm sure, have known this place, Terezin. It's a small transit camp in the then Czechoslovakia, where more than 140,000 Jews from the West were sent in. And through Terezin, there were further deported to the East, to the death camps like Auschwitz. And what I found was really fascinating about this particular camp is that among the prisoners, there were many famous Jewish musicians, painters, and writers, and they were secretly organizing a school for children. And one of the well-known classes was taught by Friederike Brandeis. She was teaching kids drawings. And although many of the children who had participated in this art class were later on killed at a place like Auschwitz, somebody hid the kids' paintings between walls in the barracks. And after the war, nearly 5,000 drawings were discovered. And I wondered, maybe Hana Brady was one of the students in the art class, because from the date of birth written on the suitcase, says May 16th, 1931. You can guess that she was in her early teens, 12 or 13. And so I contacted the Jewish Museum in Prague, and they did find Hana's drawing. There were 5 drawings created, made by Hana. And on each drawing, she signed her name. So first we saw her name on this suitcase, and now we see her name again on these drawings. And we were getting one step closer to Hana, and we wanted to know more. But by that time, sending letters and faxes and emails didn't get me any farther. But then I was lucky to have a chance to go to Europe for a conference, and I decided to stop at Terezin. And at museum there, the curator showed me this record. It was a list of more than 90,000 names of people who were imprisoned in Terezin and later on deported to Auschwitz. And on one page, we found the name Hana Brady, 4th from the bottom here, and it says she was born May 16th, 1931. So I found Hana here, but all you can tell from this list is that people on this list were, as I said, later on killed at a place like Auschwitz. And but if you look at this list carefully, you see George Brady right above Hana Brady, the same family name. And it says 1928. You can see that George Brady, this person, is 3 years older than Hana. And on this column, it says Hana Brady and George Brady, they were both from the same town. It says Neustadt in German, and it's Nowe Mesto in then Czechoslovakia. So George Brady, 3 years older than Hana, they were from the both same town. So now I was sure that Hana Brady, the owner of the Suitcase, had a big brother. And the next moment, I realized that on this list, the name George Brady had a box around it. It was the only name which had a box around it. So I asked the curator what it means, and she told me that this person, George Brady, survived the Holocaust. And I had to return home the next day, but I ran back into the city of Prague and then ran into the Jewish Museum there, and another curator there helped me continue the search. She made some phone calls and she managed to find a Holocaust survivor named Kokolo, and he happened to be George Brady's bunkmate in Terezin. He came over to see me at the museum, and he told me that George Brady was still alive and well in Toronto, Canada. He gave me his full address. So as soon as I returned home, students and I decided to write to George in Toronto. And some students were actually worried if our letter would remind him of his little sister and hurt his feelings. But some students wanted to let him know that his little sister's Suitcase is teaching us such important lessons of the history. So we sent him a letter, and only within a few weeks, we received a letter back from George. It was 4-page long, full of happy memories with Hana. And the letter came with this photograph. And you can imagine how loud I screamed when this photo spilled out of the envelope. We were finally able to put a face to the name, which was written on the suitcase. But at the same time, the moment we saw this beautiful, innocent face, students and I were not thinking about Hana anymore. We were thinking about her big brother, George. We were thinking about the pain he must have had after losing such beautiful, sweet little sister. And he wrote in the letter that he had always felt responsible for protecting his sister. And he wanted to take her home. And after all these years, he still hadn't been able to overcome the fate of Hana. So through this pain that George has had all these years after the war, we were devastated to find the truth that we have been so eager to find. But finding Hana's brother brought us many other emotions. George came to Japan with Lara to share all these memories with kids in Japan. And he shared with us beautiful, beautiful photos from his family archive, and the other photo, yes, the other photo that he shared with us when he came to Japan was of this beautiful family he had in Toronto, Canada. Although George was the only surviving family, surviving member of the family, but he had a new beautiful family in Canada. He had 3 sons, and the youngest daughter, Lara Hana, you see here today, and he had 4 grandchildren at the time. He has many, many more now. And at the end of the search, to see his new family in Canada, it was the biggest and the happiest surprise that we had. We were really amazed. So this day, what came out of this one suitcase, George and Lara and I have traveled to schools all over the United States, as I said, but also all over Canada, Germany, Mexico, South Africa, and responses from students everywhere we go are amazingly universal. They think of their own family, friends. They think of how they would react in the face of prejudice and discrimination in their own lives. Hana, who wanted to become a school teacher in her hometown, is indeed really teaching so many children all over the world still today. And but what I'm hoping is that if we in Japan can see what's in this one simple suitcase, if we can see what story this one simple object has got to tell, I believe that we can use the same imagination and understanding, the same compassion toward the fate of, for example, another child who suffered a lot under the brutal Japanese occupation during World War II. That's what I'm truly hoping for. And so the journey of Hanas still continues. We have some new exciting projects, and I would love to come back to that during the Q&A sessions. But now I think Larichko, I think the floor is yours for the audience to hear just incredible stories. Suitcase is just one of the many incredible stories that the Brady family can share with us. So over to you, Lara.
Okay, well, way to set me up. I just want to say that Fumiko is the professional. I am just one of the storytellers. And so I thought I can see based on the audience that you probably know a lot about the Holocaust. And so I thought I'd share a little bit more about not only my history and my family's history and what makes our story unique and also not unique, but also what has really resonated with kids, and in particular, what's resonated with kids in this past year, because it's been really interesting. As Fumiko has mentioned, Hana's Suitcase has gone on and on and on, and there's always new projects. And it was one thing that always really surprised my father. We felt that, you know, when we first started talking about Hana to schools, we thought that interest would eventually die down. Then with the book, there's a play that's traveled even in the States and Japan as well as Canada. And we kind of always felt like, okay, it's a story that you know is a wonderful story, but it's aging out. And it turns out that that the story has never been more relevant than it is now. And it's just last month, 20 years ago, that Fumiko came for the first time to Canada. No, we went to Japan in March of 2001. So it's a little bit wild to be sharing this story with you tonight and having been able to share it so many times. So my story obviously does not start before World War II, but my father's story does. And my father, George, was born in 1928. He was born in the Czech town of Novo Město in what was then Czechoslovakia. And 3 years later, he had a little sister born, Hana Brady. She was born in 1931, so we're celebrating a big birthday milestone for her this year. And as we tell kids, there is that 3-year gap is a big gap. So those kids did not get along. Hana and George had their own friends. They had their own activities. They, of course, were at different grades at school. They had different interests. And my father in particular was very frustrated when his little sister tried to join in on games. But that was a normal life. And they were very lucky to live in this small town of Město with their parents, Carl and Marketa. They ran a family store. My grandfather's role in the store was to expand the store. So it didn't include just local deliveries, but he started to expand to do deliveries into different neighboring countries. He had the first gasoline station in his town. They had the first telephone. They had their phone number was number 1 until the police got a phone. So they had to give up 1. They had 11 and the police got 1. His grandfather had the first bicycle in town and so on. So they were a pretty interesting family, but they were also very involved, very integrated into the tapestry of town life. My grandfather was a volunteer firefighter. He was part of in the winter when they had to go clear the roads so that carriages could get through. He was the first guy out there with a shovel, even though he could have, in theory, paid someone to do it. And then he also was on the local soccer team. And then I luckily can say this because none of them are around anymore. He also cheated because he invited his brothers from neighboring towns to come over. They were very good soccer players. So they were very good, even though it wasn't super kosher to have someone from out of town on your team. But essentially, they were really not only part of the town, but they were well liked. And this could be seen when restrictions started coming in. The first restrictions, of course, when Jews were under curfew, they weren't allowed to shop in certain stores. They couldn't be out after a certain time. The local townskeeper who kept the clock actually would change the clock for my grandfather so that he could still listen to the radio at a neighbor's house and still make it home, in theory, under curfew, even though, of course, it was late. When Hana and George, the first real disaster for them that struck was when they were no longer able to go to school. Hana's teacher would still wave to her secretly from the window, which kind of gave her sort of a feeling of still being seen. And one of the things that we talk about, especially this year, is that when Hana and George are no longer able to go to school, it was a huge shock to their system. But of course, it wasn't so much that they lost their schooling, which of course wasn't great, but the real reason that it was devastating to them was they lost their social circle. Because of course, associating yourself with the Jewish kids, and they were the only 2 Jewish kids in their town, was very dangerous. So they lost their friends overnight. And suddenly, even though that 3-year age gap was a big difference, suddenly they realized how lucky they were to have each other. So they drove my grandmother nuts because they had scooters that they would race in. There's a long hallway in the house. But they figured out how to kind of, play within the house, within their backyard. And certainly that's something that kids can appreciate today. They managed. Hana and George had a teacher who came in to continue their classes, another Jewish man in the town who was able to help them. But really the first disaster struck when their mother, Marketa, was arrested. And the reason that she was arrested was because her brother had fled, and he was caught with a list of people who had sent him small amounts of money to help him run away. And of course, his sister had helped him. So that was enough of a provocation that they arrested her. And so she had to leave at 5 a.m. And it was one of my father's biggest regrets in his life that he didn't get up to say goodbye to her. She just came to kiss him, and that was it. He had no idea he would never see her again. She ended up in a Gestapo prison, and then eventually in the women's camp Ravensbrück, and I'll come back a little bit to her story. But somehow they still sort of muddled on. Carl, their father, tried to keep life as normal as possible, and then another restriction came in, the restriction that you had to wear the yellow star. And at this point, well, all across Europe, some families or some people were thinking that if they could move into smaller towns, they would have a better chance of hiding. And one man had decided that he would have a better chance of hiding from the Nazis in Nowe Miesto. And so he moved in. So he wasn't even from the town. But when this new restriction came that you had to wear a yellow star, he wanted to show that it didn't matter to him. So instead of cutting the star neatly out of the cloth that it came on and sewing the edges so that it had a clean look to it, he just put the whole thing on his lapel and he walked on the main town square. And that was considered such a provocation to the local Nazi that he demanded that the town be made Judenfrei that afternoon. So a big black car came to the Brady house that very afternoon, and there were 5 other very frightened men already sitting in it, and my grandfather Carl was taken that afternoon. So we can imagine, or we can't imagine, how frightening that would have been for George and Hannah. They were very young, at home alone, and suddenly there was another knock on the door, and they were very nervous to open it. But who was there was their uncle. And the reason that their uncle was not arrested was that he was Catholic. He had married their aunt, who was their father's sister. There's Jewish geography for you. Their uncle Ludwig wasn't their uncle by marriage and therefore not Jewish. So he was spared from the arrest. So of course he took in his niece and nephew, even though, again, that was a questionable move on his part. And Hannah and George tried to have a normal life for a couple more months, until the spring of 1942, when they themselves received their own deportation notice. So their deportation notice came that they had to show up in Terezin. And as Fumiko mentioned, Terezin was a fortress town. It was built in the 1790s by Franz Joseph. It was meant to house just over 5,000 army officials, and during the war years, the Nazis pushed up over 140,000 Jews from Austria, Czech Republic, Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, from all over, which included 15,000 kids, which included my father and my Aunt Hannah. So it was a scary place. It was a transit camp. It wasn't what would come later on, but 33,000 people still died at Terezin, and in particular, a lot of older people. For Hannah and George, this was particularly a shocking place because they'd managed to stay together. And my father took his responsibility very seriously as the older brother. And suddenly when they arrived in Terezin, they were separated. They were separated into a girl's home and a boy's home. And this ended up being very lucky for my father, not that he was separated from his sister, but he ended up in this incredible, incredible place, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. But my aunt was separated into a building called L410. And as Fumiko mentioned, when the secret art classes came around, she was very lucky to have Friedel Dicker Brandeis in particular as her teacher. When my dad got put into the boys' barracks, it was L417. If you ever go to Terezin, the actual museum is his building. And the first room that you go in on your left is the room that he spent 2 years. And this room was particularly incredible. He learned a lot of lessons there because it was boys who were 14 to 16 from all walks of life, coming from Prague orphanages, small towns across Czechoslovakia. And if you have boys, then of course you can imagine how well they got along under stress and under duress. They weren't allowed to leave the room for the first couple of weeks, and then eventually the building. They were allowed to leave the building. And they were 40 of them in this room at a time. And they were given, when I heard the story as a little girl, I thought he was very old. There was an overseer, sort of like a coach, who was put in charge of them. He was 27. His name was Walter Eisinger. And he basically came into this room and he said, enough. I don't want to hear any more arguing. You have to create freedom within these walls as in any way that you can. And he encouraged these kids not only to take back any freedom that they could, but in fact to create their own government. And so they created a republic. It was called the Republic of Shkid, which was after a Dostoevsky piece. And the kids took it to an nth degree. Not only did they have a government who actually decided which boys would be responsible for chores, going to get what food was available, keeping your bunk clean, all sorts of different things, breaking up fights. They had a judicial system. And there were a lot of incredible lessons that my father learned there. One in particular that always struck him was that one day it turned out that someone was stealing in the room, stealing bread. They had these small buns that they got occasionally. And it's one thing to steal, but it's another thing to steal in a camp where you know everyone's hungry. And so one boy managed to get from from sort of the like medical station a pill that if you swallowed it, it made your urine purple. And it was for testing some disease. And so they snuck that pill into one of the buns, and then 3 of the boys waited and waited to see. And then they went, every time a boy went to go pee, they went to find out who had eaten the bun. And sure enough, they caught this poor kid red-handed. And they had this whole proceedings ready. They had they had set up how they were going to run the courtroom. They had a jury, they had a judge. And before they could even get to that, he started to cry. And he explained that he had 2 younger brothers in the camps and no parents. And he was giving his brothers all of his food. And so he was hungry. So suddenly the boys realized, it didn't really matter why he was stealing. It mattered why he was stealing, but that, you don't always understand all the circumstances. And so they ended up sharing all the bread going forward with him. The other incredible thing to come out of this room is that one of the boys, Peter Gintz is his name, he actually organized a secret magazine, and the magazine was called Vedim, which means in the lead. And in the early days when they still had a typewriter and ribbon and so on, they were able to print this magazine or type it, I guess. And then eventually it was handwritten. And what's incredible is that of the 100 boys who went through this room, 40 at a time, as I mentioned, roughly 15 survived, and only 1 is alive today. But 800 pages of this magazine actually survived. And they're an incredible record talking about life in the camp, but also art in the camp. I mean, this was a perfect example of art therapy. These boys wrote poetry and stories and plays and beautiful artwork. And it was a real testament to their talent. My father always joked that maybe his talent was not in writing because he had wonderful contributions about plumbing in the camps, and because he was an apprentice plumber in Terezin, and exciting things about ventilation in the camp, which of course now in hindsight is very interesting because, if you had a space that was supposed to house 5,500 people and suddenly had 140,000 people, it was a big issue to figure out kitchens and bathrooms and all these things, but maybe not as talented as the other boys. And so it was my father's goal after the war to make sure that this story continued to be told. And so in the 90s, he managed to have the magazine published. It was called We Are Children Just the Same. And in fact, the co-editor of the magazine, his name was Kurt Gottotsch, one of my father's best friends, his bunkmate, and the man who then years later led Fumiko to George. So it's certainly an interesting story. And one of the other things that we talk about is that there was a great competition in the room one day that you could do good deeds and you'd get points. And my father won. He had 215 points, and they drew up a beautiful diploma. And he was so excited on Friday night when they would read out the magazine, he would be celebrated in front of all of his peers. And instead, what happened was it turned out that there was an article in the paper about another boy who had stayed with his friend for 3 days and 3 nights, who was very, very ill. And when he was asked, why didn't you claim the points? You could have won the competition. He said, I didn't do it for the points. I did it because it was the right thing to do. So you can imagine how quickly my father's victory deflated. And it's one thing that we always have a very hushed room of kids afterwards because they cheer when they see the diploma. And then they realize that, at a very young age, my father figured out that you sometimes do things because it's the right thing to do. But essentially, life in Terezin continued. It was a difficult place. Their grandmother came in at one point. They were very excited to see her, and then they realized very quickly what that meant for her. And in fact, it was a death sentence because she had Parkinson's before she came in, and so she had a few weeks to live in Terezin without medication. And the latrine was no latrine; it was a hole in the wood. Just terrible conditions for the seniors there. So it was actually a blessing when she passed. But as many of you know, at the end of 1944, the war was not going so well for the Nazis. And so they sort of were trying to figure out how to cover up what they were doing. And especially in the case of Terezin, they still sent 10 transports from Terezin to Auschwitz. And my father was on the first one in September and didn't know where he was going. He knew he was going up somewhere east. And of course, when he arrived in Auschwitz and the gates opened, he knew something very different was happening in Auschwitz. And we don't always share the story, but for him, he says, the real shock came when you got out in Auschwitz. You were told to leave your suitcase behind, and a woman yelled between the barbed wire to them that if they had any food, they should throw it to her because it'll be taken from them. And someone sent through a can of sardines, and a guard stepped out and machine gunned her down. And so for my father, coming from, a terrible place in Terezin, but nothing like that, that was the biggest shock. And he very quickly figured out that the rules were going to be very different. And then, of course, he found out what the smokestack was in the distance that very same day. And so he was, again, very lucky. He managed to get into a satellite of Auschwitz called Gleiwitz, where he worked as an iron worker. And he had a million stories about, getting selected for the wrong line, and then in the last minute, somehow managing to get into the other line. But he, of course, hoped that he would be the only member of his family coming this way. Unfortunately, that was not Hannah's fate. She went in the second last transport, and what was like a knife to my father's heart was that she was very excited to see her brother because she thought she was going to Terezin, to Auschwitz, to be reunited with him. And so she asked her cousin who was in the camp to help her brush her hair so that she would look nice when she saw my father. And of course, for him, that visual that when she got to Auschwitz, she got her head shaved and was gassed upon arrival was awful. My father was lucky, as I mentioned, to get into Gleiwitz. And then eventually when the death marches started, for him in January, he was, again, it's a remarkable story. Maybe we have time during Q&A, we'll get to it. He was liberated in January 21st, 1945, and made his way through war-torn Europe to Nowe Mesto, where he found out almost immediately that his family had all been murdered. And then it's a common story for a lot of people who emigrated. The communists were rolling in the next year or two, and so he decided that he better get out of there. And the quota was full for the U.S., but luckily a relative in the U.S. had another relative in Toronto, and so he was able to come in 1951 to Canada and start a new life. And he always thought about what kind of life his parents would want him to lead, and realized that he always thought they didn't want him to be embarrassed of him. At least he didn't realize that they'd be proud no matter what he would do. But he started a plumbing business based on the apprenticeship that he did in Terezin. And he, through huge coincidences, met another survivor from Terezin who had known in Terezin, who was also plumbing apprentice. And so they started a business. And then he had 3 boys. Can't get it always right. But then in the 80s, he succeeded to have a girl. And my mom is a second marriage, and she's Czech. And so we spent a lot of time going back. And my father had a very different relationship than a lot of survivors do with his hometown. He was very welcomed. He got the key to the city. And so we went to Terezin, we went to Auschwitz. We looked in that room in 1998. We looked in the room trying to find the suitcase because we knew that Hannah's suitcase existed. Couldn't find it. So we thought, well, that's the door closed on that, and that's okay. And my father explained that he was just very, very gratified that he could come back to Auschwitz and the Nazis were gone and he was coming back with the next generation. And we thought that was it until we got a letter from Japan, and he couldn't believe it because we had never been to Japan. We didn't have any business dealings in Japan. And there was this very polite letter from Fumiko explaining that the kids were interested in the suitcase. And what's particularly unique about Fumiko having found George is that we have one of the largest personal archives. We have about 500 photos, pre-war, of course. We have video of our family from 1938. And then we have all the documents. And the reason that we have all the documents is because when my grandparents were arrested, my father started smuggling things from the house to his uncle's house. So we have all the documents pre-war. And then Hannah's report card, George's report card, his diploma from Terezin, all these other things were taken home because one of his aunts was actually liberated in Terezin. And so she kept all the items as the kids went on to Auschwitz. And then I think, like a lot of families, we're just pack rats, that we have everything else safely stowed in boxes. And I'll leave you with the last thing, which is one of the most important pieces from our collection, is that when my grandmother was in Ravensbrück, of course, there was nothing that she could send home that would have real value, but she wanted to send something for Hannah's birthday. And so the most amazing thing is that the only possession she had was bread. And so she actually created little charm hearts and a lucky horseshoe for good luck, as well as a necklace made of good quality European bread. And we have that to this day at home. And it's just such an amazing tribute to her. It still has her fingerprints in it. So that's sort of our biggest, treasure. And the big thing that I've figured out is, the Holocaust happened so many years ago, and I'm probably one of the younger children of survivors on the planet. But what I end up doing is I end up giving a link to history. And it's something that we see is incredibly important. And one of the most sort of amazing things that I've seen, especially in the last 2 years, has been that kids, of course, see a real hero in Fumiko, because she's able to, don't listen anymore, Fumiko. She's able to translate another human being's story. And she's done it not only with Hannah's story, but with many other stories, remarkable stories. And that gives kids a lot of hope that they can share other people's stories in their communities. And of course, we've seen that there's so much in the news now. And it really, we joke, but it's true that the last few generations haven't done enough to fix our world and the issues. And so it's really gratifying to see the letters that kids continue to write to us, even after George's passing. I thought that, letters would stop, and they've continued. And that children understand that genocide is a process, and that it doesn't happen overnight. And that, while humans are complicated and there's bystanders and, all these other complicated aspects of it, they do understand that these choices have consequences and that they have a voice. And that's been really the biggest inspiration to us with Hana's Suitcase, is that we really feel like it'll continue to go on and on. And I think in typical Brady form, I've spoken too much. So I think we'll open it up to questions. And I will say there's nothing you can ask us that we haven't been asked. So kids are always nervous. Adults are even worse, to ask the wrong question or something that isn't, insensitive, but we've been asked everything. So we'd certainly love to hear from you, and we'll open it up.
Thank you both. I'm stunned actually by this. It's because I teach this topic, and because I mention Fumiko and Lara in my story that I tell to kids. So now to be able to meet you both, albeit remotely, this is very cool. And to pick up a few tidbits that are fascinating just makes this even more exciting. So for the next time I get to teach it. So thank you both for that. We're going to have Linda Denning handle the question part of this. So if you have a question, please use the chat function, the drop down, look for Linda D and write the question, and she will handle that. So you're asking, who is Linda Denning? I will tell you. Linda is a veteran volunteer of the museum. She began with us in 2006. That was just after retiring from a 30-year career with Collier County's University of Florida Extension Service. And her work there centered on youth development, so as well as adult leadership. So it was transitioning those kids from youth to adult leadership. She first came across Hana's Suitcase when she was actually working on an age-appropriate bibliography for our previous museum director. So she was putting together educational materials. And since then, she has embraced this story and tells everyone who will listen to her about it. So let's bring on museum veteran volunteer, Linda Denning.
Thank you, and good evening to everyone. And wow, and I would say Ohio gozaimasu to, which is good morning to Fumiko, because it's early in the morning for you. And domo arigato, thank you very much. Thank you very much to you both. I've been to Japan. My late brother lived in Japan for many years. And and this story just resonated with me. It's a sad story, and it's a story of dedication and perseverance. And I bow to you both. I have so much respect and admiration for you, for caring, for wanting to make the suitcase, represent a life, and for what you did to pursue that story and to make it come alive. And Lara, for you and George to be so open about sharing such a painful part of your family's history. So we're so happy that both of you are here. And I think it's a miraculous story in the sense that it just so happened that Ludmila and Terezin came to work on a holiday. And it just so happened that at the museum in Prague that they were able to locate Kurt Kotak. And it just so happened that he had George's address. So, I mean, I think when George said this is a story that meant to be told, that's just so true. So we have some questions are coming in. And the first one I think was for Fumiko. And she's saying, congratulating you on all your work. And she was impressed. This is Linda Wertheim. She says, I'm very impressed with the children's interest and sensitivity to the subject. How were the children affected by this experience? Did any of them choose to study subjects like the Holocaust or go into careers, that might have been influenced by this?
Yes, they are the original Small Wings kids are now in their 30s, 40s, and they were certainly interested in learning more about the history of the Holocaust right after we found out about this stories behind this one particular suitcase. But it also really opened up their world. We live in a small island country, and we these many kids don't have much chance to meet with friends of different religion, different culture, but they really thought that it's important to go out and learn about new cultures. And so now one of the original member of Small Wings, they do all sorts of different wonderful things now. We are actually having a reunion next month when we invite Lara on Hana Brady's 90th anniversary birthday, but the youngest member is now a mother, and she's a doctor, and she told me that the reason why she wanted to be a doctor is really she learned about the importance of human life through the story of Hana and George, and she wanted to do something to really help people. And the other member is is a specialist in rural development in Thailand now. She's fluent in Thai, and she's doing an amazing work. And so Hana's story, of course, really triggered their interest in learning more about the Holocaust, but it didn't stop there. It really made them want to learn just more about the world and more about what they can do, what they want to do. And so I was really lucky to meet these kids.
So with Small Wings, was that an ongoing group, or was that just a short, do you still have a Small Wings group?
Unfortunately, they've all graduated. In many years ago, we used to have this small room we rented in an apartment building in Tokyo, but we are supported solely through individual donations. The Brady family has given us tremendous support in the past years, but no governmental support. And so we unfortunately had to let it go. But instead, we do outreach. So as I said, Hana Suitcase has traveled to more than 1,200 schools all over Japan. And that way we can reach many more students. And so when we closed this exhibition room in 2003, the Small Wings members, they've all graduated. But it's really exciting to receive letters from kids in the United States. They want to create their own Small Wings group, and it's really, really wonderful.
Yeah, that sounds like you were really onto something. Okay, this is Falara. Let's see. Someone's wanting to know if anyone in your family has written up all your father's stories. It sounds like you have a lot to share.
I am getting a bit of pressure for my brothers and Fumiko. There is George's book coming out, but somehow I didn't get as much work done on mat leave as I thought I might get done. So yes, George's story is for the most part written down.
Okay, and also, what did it mean to your father to be involved with the story hearing after Fumiko contacted him?
Him and everything. My father certainly was sharing the story of Vedim, of those boys, before Fumiko came into our lives. But I think, like many survivors, he felt like he had a real purpose and owed those who did not make it out to keep their memory alive. And so, that's it's for him, that was the biggest thing. It was at a certain point, it was no longer about Hana. It was about giving a voice to, we know Hana's story, but we don't know millions of other children who didn't have a big brother who survived to share their story. And that's sort of continued generationally, where I've now seen, we have I was very blessed to grow up with a lot of survivors in my life all around the world. And as we have less and less survivors, the impetus falls to the next generation to share those stories. So that was very important to both my father and I, that I could share those stories.
Okay, how old were you when you first learned the family history?
Oh, he was bad. I was like 6 when he was telling me liberation stories, like really naughty stories on the front of, 17-year-old boys at that time, being very troublesome once they were liberated. But my brothers were in a different generation. I think it's pretty common. They knew that he had a tattoo on his arm for some reason. They didn't dare ask. They figured, he always said it was his home phone number, which they knew wasn't true. And it came around, he was in his 50s when I was born, and I wasn't really interested in him saying that he didn't want to talk about it. I desperately wanted to know about how my aunt managed him. and what my family was like. And I also just, I mean, as a child, I would have been 9. Why would someone kill a child? It didn't make any sense. And so I knew he was wrong. And that's why I made him tell me the story repeatedly, because there's an intersection here in Toronto where I knew I would meet Hana because it was a huge mistake. And I'd be able to remake them. So he was stuck with dealing with all my questions, which is why we ended up going back to Auschwitz with 2 other survivors, because he was tired of my questions.
Oh, wow. Okay, this is for Fumiko. Have you had contact or support with the Jewish communities in the Tokyo or Kobe?
Yes, we have received such generous support from the Jewish Community Center in Tokyo. We work together to organize Yom Hashoah, and I've been really close. I've been in touch with them closely, and there's actually one survivor living in Tokyo, and he happens to be my neighbor. He was hiding with his brother and his grandparents in the ghetto in Budapest. And so 20 years ago, he didn't want to share with us his story because he was very little, and he wasn't. It was really difficult for him to talk about it. But 3 years ago, he started joining in our events, and he started slowly sharing with us his story. And what's fascinating about his story is that he studied in Germany. He's a pianist, and he studied the piano in Germany after the war. And so it's really fascinating to hear from him how Germany has evolved in facing with its own past, 60s, 70s, and today. And so this culture of memory in Germany has really inspired a lot of students in Japan. Okay, what about Japan? What can we do to really face with our own dark history during the war? And so he's really inspiring.
Very interesting. Okay, this one is Falara. What do you think contributed to George's resiliency? I mean, he obviously survived many indignities and hardships, and yet he was able to create a wonderful family in Canada.
It's something my sister-in-laws and I talk a lot about, childhood development and all these other things. My father attributed it, he had a very large grandmother, and she one day found out that the governess had punished my father for something he deserved. But she was not going to have anyone touch her little Georgie. He would have been 3 at the time. And so she came after the governess with a ladle and a butcher knife and said that if you ever touch my little Georgie again, I will quarter you and ladle you into soup. And my father said, with that kind of moral backing in early life, you're set for life. But the reality of it is that he had a fairly normal life, a very sheltered, healthy life until he was 12. So, that's when the restrictions started to come in. And so he knew when he survived that he owed it to his parents to live a life that would make them proud. And it was something that was really, Hannah's death kept him up at night, but he knew he had a real responsibility, a family responsibility to start over. And so it was, I grew up knowing that my brothers and I, you can break one stick, but you can't break 4 tied together. And that was for him family. He was called the architect of family time. I think Fumiko can corroborate that one. But that really is his resilience. And then also just that, he was young enough. Kids are tremendously resilient to be able to make it through. And that really was a combination of luck and him helping that luck.
There seemed to be a certain maturity, almost, was remarkable that they knew enough to write down all their frustrations and to bury them. I mean, that's the kind of thing a therapist would tell you to do today. So to know to do that at the age of 12, I thought was pretty remarkable.
And that's the number one question we get asked is what happened to the bottle? So for anyone that doesn't know what we're talking about, when the restrictions started, Hana and George were very frustrated, Hana in particular. And George suggested that they write down all their frustrations and bury them in a bottle. And then when it was all over, they would dig up the bottle and they'd be able to have lemonade and laugh about it. And so kids need to know what happened to the bottle. And you see us digging it in the film. And the new owner of the house, the wonderful new owner of the house, was watching us dig in his brand new lawn. But no, we did not find the bottle. And my father felt like it belonged to, it really truly belongs to stay there. Because, you know, since Hana was never able to get it with him after the war, he felt like it was a tribute to them. So that's the bottle story.
Okay. Ida's asking Lara if you ever met Sidney Tarsig, who I think was the last survivor. He spoke here in Naples.
Did he? Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
He's the one who survived. He's the one who saved the book. Vedim, because he was the one boy who stayed behind in the room. I mentioned 100 went through that room, room number 1, and only 15 survived. And yeah, we had a wonderful reunion. I'm trying to think if any of the boys lived close to Naples. I think one was in Florida, but we had a wonderful reunion in Seattle still when there were about 5 or 6 of them still alive a few years ago. And there's an oratorio Terezin music made to the poems. But yeah, no, Sid's great.
Well, actually, when he spoke here and they showed the film of the boys of Drusenstadt, and I saw George in the film, and I said to Ida, that's George Brady, that's Hannah's, you know, brother. And she said she didn't know the story. And that's kind of what led to tonight, because I gave her the book. And then she contacted Fumiko and you, and here we are. So that's pretty remarkable. Yeah. So let's see what else we have here. Oh, someone wants to know if the video clips of George and Hana in the film are actual video clips, or is that, you know?
No, it's a docudrama. So those clips are with actors. Although Fumiko may correct me, but I think we do show the original, maybe we don't. There is original footage of Carl and Marketa and Hana and George, because Uncle Ludwig, who's in the book, he borrowed a camera from the local pharmacist and took a video in 1938. So we actually do have all of them on camera.
Okay, but they're not used in the film.
No, I don't think so.
No, you know, the film is a very powerful teaching tool for cross-cultural learning, and it's remarkable to see the children from 3 continents there. Were there any challenges in making the film, and how did you resolve them?
Well, my father would tell you that he and I are tremendous actors and that Fumiko had to come up to scratch, but no, there were no, you know, the challenges, of course, are the obvious challenges of production, trying to film across 3 different continents. And actually, I will say the problem was Fumiko, because my father and I never know what we're going to say before we do, and then we apologize later. Fumiko is so careful and is just like, she's just a glorious educator. I know she doesn't like that term, but Fumiko thinks about what she's going to say, and we interrupt her. And so the director definitely had to sort of say, like, wait, let Fumiko get a word in edgewise. But no, I mean, once you see the kids take the story and run with it, I mean, they're the most compelling part of it. And that's really been the most amazing part of this journey, that, you know, we talk to kids. Canada is one of the most multicultural countries, and yet still we don't think about it in the way. I mean, we still have terrible incidents and terrible history here, but we don't think about race in the same way. I mean, now finally it's coming up in conversation, but we've had incredible discussions with kids in South Africa where they talked about how they were shocked that there was white on white hatred, which I had never thought about the Holocaust in those racial terms. But for them, you know, comparing it to apartheid, and certainly when we were in Australia with the Aborigine communities there, and here in Canada, we have, you know, our own history with the Indigenous here, and being able to talk to Métis, and, you know, kids glom onto things like my father wore a hearing aid. And so kids loved the idea that, you know, if they had a hearing issue, that, you know, they could connect with him. Certainly the story, you know, Fumiko's English is perfect, but my father's English was very accented. And so kids, especially, you know, new immigrants, are wondering what's it like to start in a country, and also to see that he was able to successfully root himself in that new country. So those are amazing connections that we've seen. And as I mentioned, you know, Fumiko's the true hero. If Fumiko were a Jewish teacher from the Bronx who found the story, it'd be a great story. But it's a phenomenal story when you take into account that you have someone who lives in Japan, which is so geographically far away. I wish it were much closer right now. And of course, you know, the history that she's teaching is so different to that population. And, you know, they have their own history, their own actions during World War II. And that is the most remarkable part of our story. You know, the Brady story is unique, of course, like all Holocaust stories, like all genocide stories, but there's so many themes that are similar. That Fumiko pulled it out of the darkness is really the most amazing part. And that's what shows kids that you can share someone else's story.
Wow. Yeah. Let's see. Someone here is watching from Kansas City, said, I saw the play at the Coterie Theater presented by the Midwest Center of Holocaust Education. Okay, she's thanking you. There wasn't a question there. I thought there might be a question, but she's thanking you for being here, which we all do. You know, you mentioned South Africa. I was going to ask you about that because I saw that Archbishop Emeritus had written a foreword to the book. And he said that the children there could relate to this story because of their painful history. So that's it's amazing that you've been all over the world with this. You know, in Canada, we heard that Canada was not especially welcoming to Jews either during the war or even right after the war. So I wondered if George, being a plumber, whether that skill helped him to get into Canada, or it was just that he had a relative there who could sponsor him.
No, it's because he had a relative who was able to sponsor him. But no, the quote from one of the politicians at the time was that none is too many.
Yes.
Yeah, no, Canada was definitely not welcoming. And my father, luckily enough, I mean, American audiences will appreciate this, that his business partner was Joe Seidner. And so the plumbing company, which still exists today, is called Brady and Seidner. And one day a client called and said he was glad that at least there was a Canadian in the mix, and it wasn't just, you know, these crazy Europeans starting a business, because they assumed that the Brady was not a European. Little did they know that it wasn't, you know, that straightforward. And what I would just say is that this has been for us, you know, for Fumiko normally is traveling, and she's taking, I'm talking totally on your behalf, Fumiko, teaching other educators and students. But this year has been particularly remarkable where, you know, we're zooming into people's homes, and we're seeing that especially. I mean, I'm feeling, you know, the weight of zooming right into kids' bedrooms as they're, you know, not going to school and they're homeschooling, or not homeschooling, but schooling from home. And that, you know, sends a whole other layer when we talk about, you know, these issues. And so that's been particularly interesting. But I think for Fumiko, it's been a strange year to be totally landlocked in Tokyo.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. How did the pandemic affect the schools, and are they open again? And how is Holocaust education happening in Japan these days?
Yes, I was really upset when all the school appointments were canceled in March last year. And for the past 5 years, I bring a group of university students and educators on a trip to Europe. I take them to Auschwitz, I take them to Warsaw, Krakow, and also I take them to Germany. But it was all again canceled, and so I had to learn how to use Zoom, and it actually really opened up my a lot of opportunities for us. I actually was able to manage more sessions with students and teachers last year, actually through Zoom. And since November last year, the schools have opened up again. So Hana Suitcase is now traveling again. Yeah, we are in the middle of the fourth wave now, and the government just issued a state of emergency, but the school is open. So I have an appointment next week, and yes, it's still going.
Do you do all the teaching yourself, or do the teachers come for training, or how does this happen?
Yeah, we do teachers workshop, and so we team up with teachers. They do the preparation, and we come in to give presentations. And for the past years, the Hanas Drawings was produced in a play. So I have worked with actors who have actually played the role of Hana, George, and their parents. And so they come to schools with me to give presentations. So yes, we have a small team.
So do you have volunteers also that do this work with you? And you mentioned the one survivor, but do you have volunteers from the community that help or not in the center even?
Yeah, we have a small group of volunteers, friends who support my activities. Now I have 3 intern students, university students, who are helping me to organize events online, and yeah, so very.
You know, what brought you to this work? What this has become your life's work. How did you begin? How did you get drawn into this?
Yeah, I actually have never studied the history of the Holocaust, never specialized in the history of the Holocaust. I did my master's in so-called development studies. I was interested in Japanese foreign aid in Asia, Africa, and so I studied 1 year in England. And after I came back, it was really through a chance meeting that this group of friends were starting this educational, informal education. And I was just invited in as a helper at the beginning. And for me, the most important thing in life is really to meet someone you look up to as a role model. And I think to me, it was the survivors of the Holocaust. I was lucky to interview survivors, and their resilience, their optimism in life, they're full of energy after, in spite of what they went through. That really was really inspiring. And after meeting a person like George Brady, really changes your life. And through getting to know these survivors, the more you learn about it, the more you want to learn about it. And so yeah, the meeting with the survivors, especially George Brady, inspired me to work on this history of the Holocaust.
Oh, I'm so glad it did. I'm so glad it did. Yeah. Lara, what about Holocaust education in Czechoslovakia? Do you follow what's going on there at all?
It's not necessarily part of the curriculum. A lot of teachers are teaching it, but it's the Czechs have a very complicated relationship with their own history. That being said, you know, my father, once we were being interviewed on Czech radio, and he commented that he had won the highest civilian award from the German government and an award from the Canadian or Ontario government. And he said, you know, and I've never heard anything from the Czech Republic. And the flood of emails and letters that we got from families, from teachers, was quite remarkable. And in fact, there's one particular school that has decided to, they got really gripped by the idea that this Vedim magazine was published from 1942 until 44, when the authors all went to Auschwitz, or well, except for one. And that they could no longer publish the magazine. And so he had this idea that kids today could start reissuing the magazine. And so there's actually a national competition. You have to read one of the diaries of the boys, you have to read the magazine, and then these kids create their own Vedim. So there is a serious upswing. And we've also seen out of the Vedim story, one of the plays was translated into French and is being used against, essentially to fight against the government there, the Front National, which is quite a terrible government, a party, sorry, not government. So there is a lot of offshoots from this story that seem to make a big difference in curriculum. And in fact, it's Fumiko who had Hana Suitcase added to the English-speaking curriculum, am I crazy? No. In Japan, and then also cool things. My father was not super impressed when Fumiko explained that there was going to be a manga comic of Hana and George. And then when we saw it and we understood that, you know, there's a whole generation of especially teen boys who are not interested in reading, and that's actually manga is one of the great ways to get them back into literature. It was quite something to see, as well as the book has been made into Braille, and so it's been shared all over the place. And yeah, it's just, we gave it to Falashi kids in Israel. Like, it's just been a very cool experience to be able to share the story with kids who wouldn't have access to it otherwise.
Okay, and this has to be the last question, but your great aunt and uncle, Ludwig and Hedda, as an interfaith couple, were they discriminated against during the war?
Yeah, they were forced to divorce at the Gestapo office, and my uncle Ludwig explained that he had married her for good or for bad, and that, you know, but they forced them to be divorced, and they deported Hedda to Terezin. Luckily, their daughter did not make it to the deportation, so she stayed home, although it was a very strange time because she wasn't allowed to go anywhere in the town except for church, of all places, because it didn't occur to them that they should put a sign that no Jews allowed in the church. So that became her refuge. And he was thrown out of his job. And so it had major implications, of course, very different ones. But yeah, it was a tough go. And but it meant that when my father came home, when he found out that his parents had been murdered, he found out a few weeks later that Hana had been as well, but he got to go home to his uncle and aunt, and they were able to, you know, give him a little bit of a home base before he left again.
Thank you. People are asking how they can support your work, and I would refer everyone to the email that you got today with the Zoom link. If you scroll all the way down, there are some links to the event happening on May 16th, and also to ways that you can support the Tokyo Holocaust Center. So I know we could go on all night, at least I could.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Yeah, but I know we have a limit, so I'm gonna have to live with it, unfortunately. But I would want to thank everyone for being here, for being part of this conversation, and certainly to Sam and Susan Suarez and the museum staff, and to Ida, to everyone to help make this happen. And I challenge everyone to keep Hana's story alive as an important warning of the dire consequences of when we demonize differences. So I hope our paths cross again. And I wish you all well. And I'm going to now turn this over to Ida, who has a few remarks, and then Sam. So thank you.
Well, my first remark is a huge thank you. I can't tell you how excited I am that we were able to get Fumiko and Lara here. But I also owe a big thank you to Linda, because she sent me the book. And when you read the book, and our theme this year was heroes, heroines, and helpers. Fumiko, you really are a hero to read everything that you did to find out about the suitcase. And I really tell people, this is a young adult book, but it's perfect for adults. But you know, if you have grandchildren or whatever, I mean, it's a book that they should definitely read. It's just fabulous. And I wish you were here in person. You could autograph the copy that Linda gave me, and I could give you a great big hug as well. But I also think that the person who was the donor, Fumiko, that managed to set this up really, you know, I don't know if that person's still alive, but, you know, to have done that, I think that's just so important that someone in Japan wanted to do this to have children understand more. That the whole story is just amazing how everything fit together. And as a child of survivors myself, I just thank you so much for passing this story on, because it's a story that really, I think, resonates to young people, you know, and to everyone. But I really thank you so much. And also thanks to the museum, thanks to the staff there. And thank you to all of you listeners and the supporters of Jen Shoah. This is I'm leaving the chairpersonship of that group, but I hope it'll be in good hands with future people. And I thank you all for your support. Sam.
Yeah, I echo everyone's thoughts with thanks for Fumiko and Lara, and of course, Linda and Ida and all the guests who are here. If you'd like to review the video, or if you joined us late, it will be on our YouTube channel probably tomorrow or the next day. Want to thank everybody until we see you next time. Take care.